So in part one of looking at skills to help cope with COVID-19, I wanted to take a brief look at thinking. So how we think, what we think when we're stressed and anxious, and what kind of ways do we think and what happens to our thinking in those situations. So in the first part, I want to just look at basically what is a thought. Thoughts are what guide us, thoughts are what we're listening to all day, thoughts are what direct us, but we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about our thoughts. So in a nutshell, a thought is a neuron firing, it's electrical activity in the brain. And depending on what part of the brain the neuron is firing, will dictate what kind of a thought you're having. So basically it's like electrical impulses going through your brain. And if you were to explain this maybe to your kids, you might say a thought is like a mental fart. The less attention you pay to it, often the better. Another thing to think about when we're thinking about our thoughts is, are they always true? And often negative thoughts can seem much more realistic and have much more impact than positive or constructive thoughts. And there's a reason for that. So when we're stressed, often we pay much more attention to negative thoughts than to constructive or helpful thoughts. First of all, what is stress? Stress is our emotional and physical response to our situation around us. So if there are more demands on us than we have resources for, we will get stressed. If there's lots of demands but we have lots of resources, no problem. If there's very few resources but very few demands, that's no problem either. But when you get an imbalance in stress, the weighing scales gets out of kilter. And that's when we feel under pressure. We feel it emotionally in our feelings, and we can feel it physically in our body. Like an increased heart rate, a knot in our stomach, our breathing can get shallow. In our head, we can get kind of like a fuzzy brain or brain freeze, if anyone is familiar with that. And because there's an awful lot of information out there at the moment about COVID, there's new updates every day, and there's new supports being put in place and things are changing. There's a lot of overwhelm going on. So lots of us are feeling stressed that there's much more demands being asked of us than we have resources for. And I think that's why it's important. And it's great that the Chamber have asked me to do this, because the Chamber have access to lots of resources, so that even though there are demands, there are lots of resources available if people can look for them. So that's what we can have a look at again today. So what kind of things cause stress? It can be external factors such as job demands, busy maybe work-life balance with kids and maybe older parents, or it can be internal factors like pressure we put on ourselves, perfectionism, always wanting things to be perfect, offering to do things maybe when you're not really able to do them. So it can be an external or an internal factor can cause stress. Also, things that we think are nice things like events or weddings or Christmas, a job promotion, pregnancy, they can be stressful even though they're things that we want. In this current situation, almost everything is stressful, because if you have a birthday coming, you can't ask your friends. If you're expecting, can you have a partner with you? If you've just opened a new business, what's going to happen to it? If you're an established business, is it going to be affected? So things that previously were very constructive and useful in your life are now all kind of in upheaval and uncertain, and all of that adds to stress. So if we were to use the analogy of a bucket, life is like the tap, there's always water pouring, but if we don't have holes in the bucket to release all the demands that life is putting on us, the bucket will overflow, and that's like the analogy for stress. So it's really important that if we can't turn off the tap, and at the moment we all have to go along with everything that the government is doing, we can't change the situation that's going on because it's a health risk. So we have to look at ways of either increasing our bucket or putting holes in it to let some of that stress out. And that's where the Chamber wants to help. They have access to resources, and they can guide you in directions that will help increase your capacity to deal with these extra demands. Okay, so if we think about stress, it can often happen in a loop. And in my work as a cognitive behavioural therapist, C is CBT, C is cognitions, that's our thinking, B is the behaviours, and we look at both sides to see how things can be changed to help people deal with stressful situations. So if we were to look at a typical thought in a situation like this where there's a lot of overwhelm, there's a lot of uncertainty, a very typical thought might be, I can't cope with this. And when you think like that, that has a physical effect on you. It puts you into flight or fight mode. The body releases adrenaline then to try and cope with that. So you get lots of the physical symptoms of adrenaline, like I said earlier, the knot in your stomach, your heart rate pounding, maybe shallow breathing. And often then we can mistake those physical signs for meaning something is wrong. So I feel bad, so things must be bad. So if we go back to the original thought, I can't cope, then you get physical sensations. You might get distracted. You might start, I'm terrible for starting something and coming away from it. So I might have 10 projects on the go at the same time. And then at the end of the day, you're saying, what did I achieve? And because nothing is finished, you feel you haven't achieved anything. And that can then add to the feeling, I can't cope, I'm getting nothing done. So we get caught often in these vicious loops of stress and anxiety where we just kind of spiral and it just becomes more and more negative if we don't stop and catch the thought or intervene somewhere in that cycle. And that's what we do in CBT. We help and show people ways and skills of intervening, and that's what we'll do in these 3 segments. So what kind of things do we think? When we are stressed or anxious or under pressure, we often distort our thinking. We can be prone to what I would call with my clients thinking sins, things like mental filter. For example, if you have 10 clients, working away with them all over the course of the day, 9 of the clients are really nice, they're very nice interactions, but the 10th client is your least favorite person, they're a pain in the ass, you have a big row with them, or it's just a very negative interaction. You go home and your partner says to you, how was your day? What are you going to answer them? You'll say, oh, that last person, and that will affect your mood, and you will often concentrate on that. And that's a mental filter where you're zoning in on the one bad thing and you're forgetting that you had 9 great interactions before that, or that the rest of the day was actually really good. Other thinking sins that we might engage in is mind reading, assuming we know what other people think. Emotional thinking is another one where we follow our feelings instead of following facts and evidence. So feeling bad, if you've a knot in your stomach before, say for example, if I had a knot in my stomach before I did this talk, I might have gone, oh, I shouldn't do it, I'm not able, I'll make a mistake, I'll fluff it up, instead of going, take a deep breath and calm yourself and don't go off your feelings. Feelings are notorious for leading us in the wrong way. Other kinds of, and there is a sheet that I will link so that you can access that afterwards. Other kind of thinking sins are black and white thinking. So it's all good or it's all bad. And during such uncertainty as we're going through at the moment with the COVID pandemic, you might think it's all bad. And that's not the fact. There are supports and helps. There are signs for the government working very hard to help everybody recover. So it's very important to keep your thinking balanced. So when you're stressed, stop and think, maybe have a read of this sheet, get familiar with these thinking styles and say to yourself, okay, what kind of thinking am I using here? Is it mind reading? Is it black and white thinking? Is it emotional reasoning? Is it memories? If you've had a previous difficult situation with a business, this could be bringing back unhappy or difficult memories. So then you're dealing with 2 lots of stress, your past stress and your current stress. So it's important as well to try and sift out, what am I actually focusing on? Is it the past or is it the present? And as much as possible, keep things based in the present. So that's just an overview, very brief, because I know everybody's attention spans are probably reduced at the moment, but just broadly, how we think, what happens to us when we get stressed, and what can happen to our thinking, and what are typical cognitive distortions or thinking sins that we can engage in when we're stressed and anxious. Another thing to keep in mind about thinking is where in the brain it comes from. And when we're stressed and anxious, our thinking tends to come from the primitive part of the brain, the part of the brain that responds to what we all are fairly familiar with, fight or flight. So if you're under threat of some sort, like if you're about to cross the road and there's a truck coming hurtling at you, you'll jump back and go, oh my, you might act before you fully realised what's just happened there. And that's the primitive brain. It's really quick. It's act first, think later. And when we're stressed, that's the part of the brain that engages. It thinks it's keeping us safe, but it doesn't take in lots and lots of information. It's very focused and it can miss important other parts of information. So it's important when we're stressed that we're not just thinking from the primitive part of the brain, that we're engaging the rational part of the brain up here, the more advanced, refined part of the brain that we use when we're problem solving. So if I said to you, what were you worrying about 6 months ago? You went, this is the part of the brain that would be engaged. So always in times of stress, it's really important to try and use the rational part of the brain rather than the irrational. And we do that by asking questions, stopping and thinking. So think first and act later. So that's probably a summary on thinking. There's loads and loads I could say about that, but hopefully that's enough for you to get an idea of what's going on in your thoughts as you're dealing with stress.